try to do a show. Hello, everyone. As you know, if you've been with me this morning for a little while, we've tried to do a couple runs at this Daytech show, but the streaming has not been connecting, although it has been connecting. So what I mean is I can't see it, and I cannot see any questions or anyone really, just that some are watching, and then that number changes. So I don't know what to make of it. It looks like it's connecting now, though. So if it does, we'll keep going. Awesome. Welcome to our Daytech shows. As I mentioned just a moment ago, we've been trying to get it going again this morning, but had some technical difficulties that I'm not sure are mine or YouTube's, but either way, looks like we're both good to go. So I thank you if you've stayed with me. And as you know, we usually do these shows pretty regularly. It's just that in the past month, a little over a month, I've taken a break from them because we're working our way through Genesis. And I've translated some text, but not most of it. And some accounts that we're working our way through, they're worth our time and they're interesting enough for me to take a break and try to finish some of the connecting texts. So I'm primarily working in the book of Proverbs right now, as those of you who are on my CWJA forum know, and who otherwise regularly watch the videos. But I do at times break depending on what my other interests are, although I'm really committed to Proverbs right now because I'm close to finishing the text, Hebrew and Greek. So I'm hoping to finish that and put that out so people have something useful that's complete. But the Genesis accounts are very important. We've done a lot of good work there so far, I believe. We've gone through the first chapter, discussed the creation account that looks at the heavens and the earth and everything that the God Jah and those with him did to make the earth ready for the rest of what his purpose is. And so then we moved forward to Genesis chapter 2. We're focusing in on specific parts of the creation account now. The location of the garden or paradise, and some of the descriptive features of the surrounding land, as well as the creation of humans, Adam and Eve. So a familiar account in some respects, but if you've been with us on these Daytech shows, we look at things very closely, or we try to. We can't cover it all, but we do our best to highlight some of the more important features, textual information, so that you have more than just surface level understanding, right? So you know more than just Adam and Eve and a serpent-like being and this test involving the fruit of the knowledge of good and bad. And we'll get to that. We'll talk about the tree of life, all the stuff that people are often familiar with when it comes to Genesis and the Adam and Eve accounts. All right, so let's resume our text. I took a little break. I have 3 more texts. I have to translate Hebrew and Greek in Genesis 2. I'll do that later today. I'll finish them up, or tomorrow morning. They'll be up. And then we should be able to do our day text connecting that material. And then we'll work our way through the rest of what I've done in Genesis 2 and 3. I'm not going to do a lot more of the connecting text material. Like, for example, between chapters 3, 4, and 5, the texts I have not done to date. It will just take me too long. It'll take us out of our regular schedule. So, in most instances, I'm going to just keep working through what I've done. And then, at times, like now, if it's important and it will help our overall understanding of important events, then I will do it. But not all of them, because I have to finish Proverbs, and then we have to get to other texts. So that's the story behind, our little break with the Daytech shows. We should be going forward pretty regularly with the material I've done from today forward. We do a Monday through Saturday, unless, something comes up. And then on Sunday, we do a regularly scheduled CWJA talk or open session. Still not sure which one we'll do this week, but I'll make an announcement on that a little later. Now let's get to these texts. So we're in Genesis. Let's take a look. If you're following along with me, you can use the material in the description below. In the description below, I put the day text material, a little bit of an introduction about when the show will be and what it's about. And then also, I put a listing of some of the best textual witnesses to what we're reviewing so that people understand that we realize what we're reading and what the basis is for the text, the historicity of the text, the people written about in these texts, how we can verify their existence and the events that are described in these texts with other corroborative evidence through archaeology and other historical writers and documents that speak of these same things. And so our focus is on the people and the events related to the Bible. We do consider other material and events, of course, and we're very much into looking at this from a historical and scientific perspective. We look at the grammar too, but most of this is pretty clear in my view. So we're really looking to make sense of it in its historical context and then today, so that we can benefit from the material and understand it and talk to other people in a way that makes sense and that explains what's going on credibly. Right? We're not just hoping these things are true. We've really checked this out. And this is the best evidence by far. And so there's a lot of misinformation, especially with Genesis. And that's why I felt it was important to take a little more time with it so that we didn't have an incomplete first and second creation accounts. It was important enough to finish. And so let's get right to it. This is what I have recently finished. I took a lot of, the translating work takes time, but I've got a good pattern. I've got a good feel for it now. So I do it the way I feel is best and allows me to communicate what I believe it is telling us the right way in English. So Genesis chapter 2, verses 10 through 14. I'll read the Hebrew first, followed by the Greek, so you can make note of the comparative differences or similarities. There's a note that we'll read. Let me think. Should we read that? Should we finish? Sometimes I break from the material. I think what we'll do is I will go ahead and just read the note right after verse 11. So if you're following along with me in your copy of the Bible, we're going to break at the end of verse 11. And then I'm going to read a note that I have in my translation in the description below. And that's also on the translation that's on the CW Jaf form. Genesis chapter 2, verse 10. Hebrew translation. Now a river issued out of Eden to water or give drink to the special area or garden. And from there it would separate as it became 4 starting points. Verse 10, Greek translation, now a river went out from Eden to give drink to the paradise. They're separating into 4 beginnings or points, starting points. The Greek word is arche, which we're familiar with because of its use for Jesus, for example, as the beginning of creation, arche. Verse 11, Hebrew translation, the name of the one is Pishon, which is surrounding the whole land of Havilah. That is where there is gold. Verse 11, Greek translation, the name of the one, or first, but it uses the word for one. The name of the one is Pishon, or Pishon. This river is the one encircling all the land of Havilah, which is where there is gold. All right, now here's where I'm going to read a note. So when I read those 2 terms from verse 11, Hebrew and Greek, Havilah and Havilah, respectively, you're probably like, where are those places, right? Because we don't really use those terms in a referential way today. So let me read a note that I put together over this past month. I have more information, but I'm still, by the time I get to the publication of my Genesis translation, I'll have more information about a lot of this material. So I put up information I think is useful, might help give you some understanding. It's not necessarily exactly how I see the text, as you're going to see as we read this note, because I don't know. There's information we may be missing, as I'll explain. Well, let me read the note. Note on Hebrew translation of 2:11. Pishon surrounds Havilah, that part of the text. Okay, so the note reads, the Jerusalem Targum, which is basically the Aramaic translation of Genesis done by Aramaic-speaking Jews, or for Aramaic-speaking Jews, sometime around the 1st century probably, or the 2nd or 3rd century. But as the Jews began to speak more and more Aramaic, they began to translate more and more of their Hebrew texts into that language. And these became known as the Jewish Targums. So the Targum for Genesis, the Jerusalem Targum, there's different Targum editions. I'm not going to get into the credibility of the different editions in this show, but the Jerusalem Targum is often looked to give us an understanding of how the Jews at the time that the Aramaic translation of Genesis was done understood these texts. They're often done and they add more material in that kind of expressive understanding way of translating. Some refer to as paraphrase, but that's not exactly how I would put it. It's more just them identifying things in ways that aren't as explicit in the original language. So the Jerusalem Targum, or the Aramaic translation of Genesis, identifies Havilah as India and the Pishon as the river Ganges. Now, I'm not so sure if that's correct. It might be. And I say that because I'm not so sure that the earth is the same as it was before the flood. And we're reading descriptions about the land before the flood by people living after the flood, right? These Genesis 1 and 2 weren't written in the beginning. The events and, of course, the verbalization and the oral tradition and records were kept and eventually written down. But it was those oral traditions, those oral histories, those written records eventually that were the basis for what we're reading in Genesis. These are the documents, the understanding, the history carried through the flood with Noah and his family. And then as they populated the area known today as Eastern Turkey or Anatolia, where Mount Ararat is located, there are millions of graves around the base of Mount Ararat. Göbekli Tepe is about 100 or so miles from it. And it looks like exactly where a place built to house animals. The same types of animals, insects, and birds and reptiles described in Genesis that Noah gathered together for years, decades, and eventually filled the ark with and preserved them through the flood so that they repopulated the earth as we see it today. And we have people who believe in asteroid extinction causing events that basically destroyed all life on the planet, or almost all of it, and then it re-evolved the way it is today. So which is more believable, right? The story involving Noah during a time when places like Göbekli Tepe were being built, when the Yanagudi Monument, which is now underwater, was being built, the massive stone structure carved out of rock, when the Sphinx and other structures may have been built. That level of technology and engineering understanding is exactly what we see in the design and construction of the ark, which is laid out for us in detail. We're going to get to that in our Genesis readings because I've translated pretty much the entire flood account. It talks about everything, the kind of wood they used, how big to make it, how long, how wide, what to use for waterproofing, the same stuff we use today, I might add, but we'll get to that more another time. My point is that the earth changed after the flood, so much so that we see it in a design today that I think reflects two beasts fighting over prey in water and the sky with clouds above. We'll get to that another time, even more so after the flood. But before the flood, it looked different, I believe, in ways where even though we can see the location of these places, like where Eden was probably located, I'll show in a moment, and these rivers, and many of the places the Bible describes, even Mount Ararat, right, where the ark landed. So there are places still there that were there before the flood, but where they are and how they look and the different valleys and mountains and all the things that were changed because of the the massive amount of water and surging of water that Jah completed during the time when the earth was covered by water. He transformed it. So I have a hard time looking at the descriptions of rivers and places today beyond what we're going to look at the mouth of the Persian Gulf and some of the things we can still see, some of which we need satellite imagery, but they're there. But once you go beyond that region too much, and I say region, I mean the area of basically Northeast Africa and Western Asia, and the areas where you have the different Arabian countries, where you have Israel. So you have both sides of the Persian Gulf, basically. You have the Middle Eastern side and you have the North African side. How much of that is the same? Well, we already know that places like Atlantis, you can still see the remnants of it there. We've talked about that before. The Eye of the Sahara on the northwest Africa. Even Herodotus pointed out that that's where Atlantis was. And he showed different features that are no longer the way they were. One of which was water cascading down in and around the area where the concentric circles that were Atlantis existed. And you can still see all the fossil rivers flowing in and around the Eye of the Sahara, showing that the descriptions we have in Plato and Herodotus, they're pretty accurate. Okay, so, well, that's totally different today. Northwest Africa, where the Eye of the Sahara is, that appears clearly to be Atlantis. It matches the design, it matches the mountainous features, it matches the fossil rivers, it matches the opening to the south that led into the larger ocean. And so, in a similar way, I believe the descriptions we have of Eden, they're accurate. We can see parts of what were there, but they're much different. So let me finish the note. If it's correct, at least in terms of pre-flood India, this description of India as having gold, like the text goes on to say in verse 11, fits with the historical fact there were gold mines in ancient India, two of which have been operating for thousands of years in the Kolar district of Karnataka state and Hati, a town in the Raikur district of Karnataka. And then I refer to the reading in the next verse we're going to read, 2:12, which refers to pleasant resin or bdellium as a sweet-smelling resin obtained from East Indian and African trees. So again, you get the connection with India, consistent with the Targum. And then the Greek reading of verse 12, we'll get to in a moment, uses coal instead of pleasant resin or anthracite coal, which we'll talk about in a moment. That's consistent also with India. I added this part to this note this morning. So if some of you, like I know Betsy told me she read the note and appreciated parts of it, I actually added this part to it this morning because I wanted to touch bases on the anthracite coal part and determine if it was also consistent with India, and it is. So you have if it's consistent with the reading in verse 12, that the place where the Pishon is encircling, Havilah is India. Well, the pleasant resin part, or bdellium, is consistent with India, as is the Greek reading of verse 12, we're going to read next, of anthracite coal. India is among the top 5 producers of anthracite coal. And then also, we're going to read in verse 12 of the Hebrew and Greek of onyx and emerald. The Hebrew text uses onyx stone as something found in this place, Havilah, and the Greek refers to it as light green stone, possibly jade or emerald, both of which are historically mined in India and other places like Egypt. So all of this is consistent with the location that Targum identifies. I don't see the consistency between the way the rivers run and the location of, for example, the Pishon as encircling the land of India. Not according to today's map. We can see them, though, according to the way they're leaving the Persian Gulf, or coming. In the way that account reads, it's they're going out from the Persian Gulf, and so not flowing into it. And so, but the world could have been different in those days in ways where, again, the water was going out of Eden and watering the paradise, and then beginning 4 rivers. Everything was different back then. So we just have to have that understanding, use the kind of parallels we have with the Sphinx, Göbekli Tepe, Atlantis, the Eye of the Sahara. It's like that. It's going to be similar. You're going to see features. It'll be identifiable, but it's a whole different land. Totally different now. And of course, as far as Eden is concerned, it's not even on land anymore. Let's take a look at the text. So we're now at the end of verse 11, the Pishon, the river that the Targum identifies as encircling India, where there's gold. Verse 12, Hebrew translation, says, and the gold belonging to that land is good. Pleasant resin and onyx stone are there. Greek translation, verse 12, and the gold of that land is good, and there is coal. The Greek is anthrax, like the poison we often hear about. But it's probably anthracite coal, which is the purest form of coal, pure carbon. It burns the hottest, and it produces the least amount of residual compounds or pollution. And the light green stone, verse 12 of the Greek translation states, possibly green onyx, if it's an onyx stone like the Hebrew text, or emerald or jade. So when it comes to anthracite coal, for example, let's talk about that for a moment. So I already mentioned that India is among the top 5 producers, so that's consistent with it. As far as the things, the particular properties involving anthracite coal, let me just share with you a couple things here. So we'll go to just a couple basic searches, show the material, get back to the text. So anthracite is a high-ranked coal representing a coal that has been subjected to the highest grade of metamorphism. Anthracite is shiny black, hard and brittle, has the highest fixed carbon content. And its combustion process is slow. So it's very useful, for example, for hand-fired cooking and for forging metals. Very high heat. And it's a slow burner. So it states right here, if you notice, it has a small amount of impurities. Other types of coal have less carbon and more impurities. So that means that anthracite is the coal that gives the most energy and the least pollution. This is the stuff that's singled out in the Bible as being one of the resources, one of the primary resources of the land that the Pishon encircles. It's got good gold. It's got this amazing coal. Now, gold, of course, in addition to being one of our most valuable commodities and useful for jewelry and ornamentation, it has some of it is one of the best conductors of electricity. That's why, and it also can protect against ultraviolet radiation, which is why they use it to overlay satellites and things. So gold is incredibly useful, and it's very malleable. So you can mold it and bend it in ways that allow you to do things with it that harder metals require much more effort to manipulate. We have gold. We have anthracite coal, or possibly pleasant resin, useful for various things, including cooking and seasoning, and for other different types of potential physical benefits. But the anthracite coal also has benefits that ultimately lead to what, as humans, we do and would likely have done regardless of sin, and that is cook and make metals. Not in the kind of imperfect and abusive ways, often with the pollution and excessive cooking of all these different things that maybe we weren't meant to make, like the different meats. Maybe we were, maybe we weren't. My point is, we still would have cooked, made different things. And anthracite coal is perfect for it. So we have all of these special things being mentioned. The onyx stone. Many of us are familiar with onyx stone, its beauty. A lot of people use it because they see its spiritual properties. I'm not going to get into that right now. I'm going to stay more with just the basic uses of onyx stone. You can look it up more on your own. I'm not going to go over all the different, scientific benefits and uses for these things, but onyx is clearly a valuable stone if you look up the biblical references to it in terms of its use in different ornaments and features of the temple and accoutrements of the priests. So you have the black onyx stone, you have sardonyx, the red and white type onyx stone, and then you have the green onyx. So the green reference here, you have green marble onyx. And that's why in the Greek text, it basically says light green stone. That could be emerald, could be jade, or it could be green onyx, consistent with the Hebrew text reference. So we have all these things that we can use to show the relationship between the land of Eden, the rivers, and the Bible's reference to the various lands that the rivers encircled as having all these resources. This is all consistent and verifiable, not only in terms of their location and they're being mined for thousands of years and used in these places like India, but also the benefits, the reason why the Bible would single them out as these special types of resources. Okay, let's get back to the text. We read verse 12, verse 13. So that's the first one, the Pishon. Encircles the land of Havilah. The Targum identifies as India, but it could be in relation to, in terms of the biblical description, the land of India, or a land we call India now that was different at that time. Similar to the way areas of the earth like West Africa, where places like Atlantis once thrived, now are just a fragment of their former selves, and all the features of the surrounding land are different. Yet it could still be referenced the way it was referenced at that time, as long as you understand the differences. And you don't go over there looking for, all these rivers pouring water in and around the concentric circles and then flowing out through a southern entrance, right? That's not there anymore. In the same way, with the Garden of Eden, it's not there anymore. So I just pulling up this one video from an episode on the Ancient Aliens show, which you have to also watch, right? Not everything on these shows is accurate, especially their commentary. But when they show maps and physical items, this one's obviously a drawn map, but there's satellite imagery that is used as part of it. When they get to, for example, this part of the show, here they're highlighting the Wadi Batan River, which for a long time was not visible. So people were having a more difficult time up until recently, even. This is about 10 years old, this satellite photo, where it clearly shows here, you can see the little arrows that they put around it, this fossil river that was one of the rivers flowing. This is the river, right? This appears to be the river in Eden right here. You can see this little tiny fossil line right there. And then here's like a basin of some kind. This looks like an area where the water was flowing. So we could be looking right at where the Garden of Eden existed. Now, it could be further down, of course, in the Persian Gulf. But here you see clearly the rivers from the different areas. We're going to look at more closely in a moment. But this is the fossil river found in 2010, the Wadi Batan, that all flow from this one river that is right in the middle of the Persian Gulf. And it says that the river was right in the middle, flowing out of Eden watering the garden. So there's satellite imagery that they use to highlight. The closer we get, the more we can see. It actually looks like that might be a little bit of part of the land area there. Maybe Betsy can tell us more about how shallow this area is here. But obviously, as you see it get darker, you can tell that the Persian Gulf waters are now covering what was once the area of land known as Eden. So this area was all different back then. And now it's gone because Jah changed it after the purpose he set it up in place for is not happening. Other things are happening that will take us back to the paradise of God in a different way, like we read about in Revelation, but that's more of a Christian document we'll get to another time. Well, we just finished it, so that's why it's on my mind. But we're in Genesis now. We're trying to just look at things historically and from the perspective of how the people who lived at the time these events occurred saw things, and how the people who wrote about these things, like after the flood, would have described the events according to their oral and written traditions through the flood for people like Noah and others. And then as they migrated south from eastern Turkey into Sumer and then down into Egypt, where Moses was raised. In addition to spending time with the angel of Jehovah and Jehovah, we believe, before returning to Egypt to free the Hebrews. We'll get to that later in our day text readings, but keep this information in mind. Try to have a reference to use to show the different locations: the Tigris, the Euphrates, the Karun, the Wadi Batan. And of course, whether or not the Karun River could have then, it appears to have originated in northern Iran. But again, this is a modern day understanding. And it looks to me like the Ganges River comes from northern India. So whether or not a connection could have been made at some point prior to the flood, and whether or not the Karun River is the Ganges River, or whether or not the Pishon River is the Ganges River or the Karun River, there's some question about that. The Tigris and the Euphrates, everyone's pretty clear on. And then if you look, as we do our reading further, it appears to me that the Gihon is the Wadi Batan, because it is the one that then goes and encircles the land of Ethiopia, or Cush, which we're going to get to next. So let's do that. So the first river we've talked about, and the Targum identifies it as the Ganges River, which appears possibly to be connectable to the Karun River, depending on how you view northern India, northern Iran pre-flood. We have the Tigris and the Euphrates. We all know where they are. Here they are meeting together at the Persian Gulf head, and here's where Eden would have been, somewhere in here. Now the second river we're going to be reading about next in verse 13 is this Wadi Batan River. So let's do that. Verse 13, Hebrew translation, the name of the second river is Gihon. That is the one surrounding the whole land of Cush. Verse 13, Greek translation, the name of the second river is Geon. This is the one encircling all the land of Ethiopia. Now let's just finish it off here. Let's read verse 14, Hebrew translation. The name of the third river is Hiddekel. This is the one going east of Assyria. So Hiddekel would be the Tigris here. The fourth river, that one is Euphrates, right here. Greek translation, verse 14, our last text for this morning. The third river is Tigris. This is the one going opposite Assyria. But the fourth river, this one is Euphrates. So, again, the Tigris and Euphrates, there's no disputing those and the location identities of the two there. The other two appear to be fairly clear, the Wadi Batan and the Karun, the Gihon and the Pishon, respectively. So, that's what we should try to, make use of when it comes to explaining these texts to other people, that the references in these biblical texts are specific to two rivers identifiable and undisputed today, Tigris and Euphrates. Two other rivers that are identifiable, just a little bit more difficult because of the way the land has changed. Nonetheless, there are four rivers that we can show by satellite imagery are connecting right at the head of the Persian Gulf. Exactly like the Bible describes, at least in terms of one river issuing into four, and then the locations of the four that are described like we just read. So that would put Eden right here, or lower, in terms of the one river and how far it actually flowed, right? We don't know that. But this is where it starts, and you can even see the one river right there, if that's the one. It looks like it to me, coming off from this little larger collection here. So you can take a look at this on your own more so and evaluate the information in terms of what you think of it. But I'm impressed. I'm very impressed with the biblical references and descriptions that are given to these rivers, to Eden, to the different features and resources of the surrounding lands, all of which are consistent with what we can show is true even today. And that just with some changes to the landscape could also have been true back then. That is, in terms of which river actually encircled the land of Havilah, if that was India. That's really the main issue or connection for me. Or it's possible that Havilah is one of the Middle Eastern countries, that the Karun River is obviously more associated with. So either way, all of this information is consistent and not contradictory. It's not mythological. It's not some description of a garden, with all these surrounding features and marble pillars outside of the known land and just stuff that wouldn't make sense but that sounds nice, right? Like a paradise. That's not how it's described. It references specific rivers and locations. Assyria, or what would have been Assyria at that time, but was known as Assyria at the time that it was being written. All of these descriptions are things that are consistent and add credibility to the Genesis text, just like we read in the first chapter of Genesis. All of it so far is remarkably consistent with what we today in our technology, our global satellites and imagery and machinery that can be used to mine these different resources more effectively. All of it matches and aligns with the biblical text and provides reliable historical descriptions and therefore likely information about what happened at that time, which we're going to read about next. But it's important for us to understand the features. It's important for us to understand the context in which Adam and Eve were created, the land, the paradise that God prepared for them, and the surrounding lands as well, so that they could do exactly as he tells them, which we're going to read next. Become many and multiply and subdue the earth. He didn't just put them on a dry rock and say, well, go forth and live and I'll give you what you need as you need it. No, it's all there. It's all here. We've been using it our entire lives. And Jehovah put it there for us to use our entire lives. The best, cleanest burning fuel. The best conducting and malleable metal. The types of stones that would be useful in ornamentation, and if it's green emerald, for example, in illuminating light and providing other means of utility for humankind, as well as pleasant resins and all these different things that we use today or could use today to cook, to create energy, and for our purposes, right? For heating and cooling. But back then, probably that wouldn't have been necessary. It probably would have been more efficiently used in ways that were necessary for the elevation of perfect humans into the type of global society that Jah envisioned, that Jah wanted us to realize. We're kind of there today. We're just barely scratching the surface of effectively using all these resources and globalizing technology in ways that allow us to communicate more effectively. And even though that is happening, it's still fraught with difficulty. War is always a constant threat. None of these things would have been happening if we would have listened all the way back then. Okay, but here we are now, so we have to deal with it. At least we have these texts. We know they're credible. They make sense. They describe things that are either reliably associated with what we can see today, like, for example, these fossil rivers and the descriptions of them encircling various lands filled with these different resources. And they describe the events that likely took place, which then changed the land in ways that, while it's not the same, we can still identify today. That's impressive, right? That's not just something we hope is true. That's like, okay, this says this, and there it is. Wow, how about that? There's a satellite image that shows that river that these people way back then couldn't see. And in fact, it's possible even the writer of Genesis couldn't see some of these things in ways that he simply believed because he knew they took place based on their oral and written traditions carried through before the flood. And then, of course, being closer to those events in ways where even we today can see evidence that they took place, right? Yonaguni Monument, all these different sunken cities, Lake Titicaca, these massive remnants in places like Pumapunku or Gobekli Tepe, as I've mentioned. Well, who was building those things? According to the Bible, it was humans who were bigger and involved with other beings like giants, and that fits as well, as we'll discuss further in our Genesis Day text readings. So I hope you're benefiting from these texts and from the information that I try to provide to accent what it describes so that you're more aware of the relevance of these things. Why does it say it's a land filled with good gold? Why does it say that it has coal or anthracite coal or light green stone? What's the potential benefit of these things in a perfect world, right? Because those resources would have been put there by Jah with the belief and hope and design that humans would utilize them correctly while still allowing us to choose incorrectly. That's just like a good parent, right? Because the very type of people who would say that he shouldn't allow us to choose those things and make us more robotic would then complain and say, hey, we should get to choose these things, which is really what got us all started on this path, right? You really won't die. You should choose. Find out on your own. Don't listen to the one who gave you everything to this point. Listen to me. I haven't given you anything yet, but I'm telling you the truth anyway, right? We know who we're talking about. We'll get to that text in a few day text shows next. So all of this can be traced back, right? Everything we're dealing with today, whether it's geopolitical tensions, resources, who we're going to listen to whom we're going to listen, all that stuff is in Genesis. And it's everywhere around us. So I guess we should continue doing these day texts, right? So we keep the information filled in our minds and we can use them as we go forward into the world that's all around us. Thank you for joining me today. I will be back tomorrow for another day text. I'm going to put a couple more verses up on the CW Jah forum. Then I'll put the show up for tomorrow. We'll keep working our way through these texts. I'm glad to be back and reviewing all this information with you. So I'll try to be more regular now that I've made some of the textual connections or translation connections. And I'm going to limit that going forward so that I don't take as many breaks or as long of breaks and we can remain more consistent. I'll do a couple here and there that I can see later on will come up and that would probably be good for us to connect. But otherwise, let's just keep going. And if we get to a section and it ends and you're like, oh, where's the next text? I haven't done it yet. So I'm not going to add other translations from Bibles I haven't done and then try to explain any differences, because I can't explain theirs. I might agree with them in parts and they might be usable, but connecting one translation with another just to fill a hole, that might open up other questions and issues that I don't want to get into right now. I want to keep reading the basic texts, get into whatever technical information we have to, convey understanding so that you can use it. You have to go forth and engage different people just like I do. This information will help you. At least I hope it does. And if it does, join me tomorrow as we continue our day text readings in Genesis.